Welcome everyone. Today we have a great pleasure of hosting a very special guest. We have Mr. Omar López Montenegro with us, who is the Human Rights Director at the Cuban American National Foundation. Those of you who do not know what Cuban American National Foundation is, this is one of the principal, most important and interesting ethnic lobbies in America. If you study the influence, American political system and the influence of ethnic groups, especially in the realm of foreign policy, but not only, Cuban American National Foundation is always there. It's one of the biggest, largest, and most influential organizations of this type. So it's indeed a very special visit. I'll say a couple of words about Mr. Montenegro. He is, of course, as I mentioned, Human Rights Director at the CAN. He was one of the founders of several dissident organizations while living in Cuba, including the Association for Freedom in Arts, the Cuban Democratic Coalition, and National Civic Union. So he was a dissident in Cuba first, and only then he migrated to America. He has given lectures about human rights in Cuba throughout the world, of course, including American Congress, University of Pennsylvania, Miami, Florida, in Bolivia, in Mexico, in Spain, Germany, Bulgaria, Dominican Republic, and I'm sure many more. He's been a delegate to the 58th, 59th, and 61st annual session of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, the World Civil Society Forum in Geneva, and delegate and speaker at the World Civil Society Assemblies. So the NGO world and human rights world has been widely covered by our guests. Speaker at many international events, International Center Democrat annual meetings in Rome, Rio de Janeiro, also in Poland, conference related to human rights. He's an author of many books and essays, for example, a compilation of poetry, translator of books about nonviolence into Spanish, published numerous articles about Cuba in newspapers and magazines around the world, Miami Herald, Ideal Magazine, and some Spanish ones which I cannot pronounce and I won't attempt to because that will be painful. We already know him, although indirectly, through this book, because we had our friend Mrs. Joanna Maszubańska has been here, who knows Mr. Montenegro and wrote this wonderful book, a series of interviews with Cuban dissidents living in America, and the interview with Mr. Montenegro is here, so we've already heard about him and we already know him. But now we have the great pleasure of hosting him in person and listening to him talking about Cuban-American relations, which in the light of recent events should be very interesting. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Omar López Montenegro.
Well, thank you very much, Phil. I don't know, is this working? Okay, I think so.
No, it's more complicated.
Yes. Thank you very much, Phil, for that great introduction. Nobody has talked that good about me since I married my ex-wife, and she doesn't talk that good about me anymore. You know, that's facts of life. So, I'm going to start by thank you for the suggestion about the title of this presentation. Mr. Obama goes to Cuba. And I made a little change and I said, Mr. Obama goes to Cuba, you can't always get what you want. So you know the reference. So from March 20 to March 22, 2016, Barack Obama went to Cuba in an official visit, being the first American president of the United States to visit the island since communism take power in 1959. Jimmy Carter went to Cuba 2 times, 2002 and 2011, but he wasn't in power anymore. The last incumbent president, American president, to visit Cuba before Barack Obama was Calvin Coolidge in 1928. So it was 78 years before Obama arrived. Calvin Coolidge arrived in Cuba on a warship, the USS Texas. So judging by only these facts and figures, Obama's visit to Cuba can undoubtedly be called as historical. It was the icing on the cake in a process that was officially launched way before, more than a year ago, exactly on December 17, 2014, when he and Raúl Castro announced the reestablishment of relations between Cuba and the United States. But this new framework of relations between the most durable democracy and the last dictatorship in the Americas really started way before, many years before these actual events took place. Prior to the announcement of December 17, there was a process of secret negotiations that lasted for 14 months. And the two protagonists of this event, Barack Obama and Raúl Castro, took power in 2004 and 2008, respectively. Obama, of course, by winning a democratic multi-party elections in the United States, and Raúl Castro, through a dynastic and despotic family succession. His power was received, it was transferred from his brother Raúl Castro in a small piece of paper. By writing this, I consider my powers to my brother Raúl. That was the succession of power in Cuba. These two major differences that still continues to exist, and it's important to remember that this major difference between the two countries still exists. These differences are perhaps the key issue in the whole process. They have been ignored, they have been marginalized, and in some cases minimized by a press who is obsessed with creating their own stories instead of reporting or investigating about the real stories. And also, it has been portrayed in a different way by geopolitical interests obsessed with creating their new spaces of power in a global world. Both factors complementing themselves very well in the case of Cuba, in a sort of symbiotic relationship in which their respective agendas coincide. The Cuban people and its aspirations for freedom and democracy were not part of the story. They became the 600-pound gorilla in the room that nobody wanted to see. Let's look at some facts and figures that support this statement. Obama's visit to Cuba was preceded by a strange mix of visitors from every range of the American society, including politicians, artists, sports stars, show business icons, and whoever wanted to have his or her part in the script. Beyoncé and Jay-Z, Conan O'Brien, Paris Hilton, Naomi Campbell, Rihanna, who took a picture naked in a decadent hotel in Havana, Carmelo Anthony, NBA stars, baseball stars, they all went to Cuba, among many others. By creating the idea that Cuba was a cool and safe place to go, this bizarre, and I call it an expeditionary force, this bizarre expeditionary force opened the path for Obama stepping into Cuba. Well, now Cuba is safe, it's cool, the president can come. Obama stepped into Cuba with his rear guard covered by the Rolling Stones, who changed the day of their planned concert in Havana to give way for Obama's visit. The Stones concert in Havana was planned for March 22, but because Obama announced that he was going to Cuba, that they moved the date of the concert. Yes, it was a production, happy ending included. The day that the re-establishment of relations was announced, December 17, 2014, December 17 is San Lazarus Day. It's the most venerated religious event in Cuba. But it's also the birthday of Pope Francis. The secret talks leading to the agreement between Cuba and the United States were carried out with the Vatican as an intermediary, with Pope Francis taking the credit for the results. So everybody got something out of it, except the Cubans, of course, who were left out of the equation. And a special report from the Cuban American National Foundation and the Foundation for Human Rights in Cuba showed that 49 American politicians, counting only elected officials like governors, senators, congressmen, and congresswomen, 49 elected American officials visited Cuba during the fiscal year following the reestablishment of relations. From January 2015 until the end of November 2015. None of them would meet with the opposition leaders, human rights activists, civil society activists inside Cuba, with the exception of John Kerry, Secretary of State, who had a meeting with representatives of the civil society when he went to Cuba. Europe also played his part, following the same lines. 11 European high dignitaries, counting only head of governments and state, visited Cuba during the same 11-month period, and none of them meet with dissidents either. The European Union, who was in the middle of the negotiation process with the Cuban regime to sign a cooperation agreement, stopped their own talks to make way for the US talks to start. A final agreement between the European Union and the Cuban government was signed by Federica Mogherini in an impromptu visit to Havana 2 days before Obama arriving in Cuba. So the European Union was in a hurry to get its own agreement before Cuba and the United States got their own agreement. And that's another characteristic that is marking this process between Cuba and the United States. It has developed into a race for Cuba. In this case, after the signing of the agreement between the European Union and Cuba, this agreement was reached in spite that there were no human rights clauses in this agreement. Like in any other political agreement that the European Union has signed with developing countries, as is established in the Autónoma agreement. And also arbitrary detentions raised in Cuba during the same period to a record level of 7,739 from January 2015 until the end of November 15. Almost 8,000 arbitrary arrests in a year with violence against the dissidents and peaceful and non-violent demonstrators in the streets. But well, like the Rolling Stones sang to the Cuban people in their closing act in the concert in Havana, you can't always get what you want. That's the message to the Cuban people. Then Mr. Obama goes to Cuba. He wasn't welcomed like Mr. Marshall in the famous Spanish film, Welcome, Mr. Marshall. He was not received at the airport by Raúl Castro, who also didn't show up the next day for the ceremony at the monument to José Martí. He was national hero. Instead, Castro sent a vice minister, a black guy, along with a translator, who was also a black guy, to accompany Obama during that ceremony. This was considered by Afro-descendant human rights activists inside Cuba, and also by myself, as a signal to diminish the importance of Obama's presence in front of communist hardliners inside the Cuban Communist Party, and also to the Cuban people watching the events on national TV, sending the message that this visit was black people business. Raúl appeared at the second event on the second day of Obama's visit, trying to reinforce the image that this was a second-hand meeting. Imagine that the President of the United States come to Cuba and President of Cuba, the so-called President of Cuba, appears the second day on the second event. The message was clear. The event in which Obama and Raúl Castro finally appeared together took place at the heart of the Castroism, the very heart of the Castro rule and dominance in Cuba, the palace of the revolution, with Castro surrounded by an entourage that included his son Alejandro Castro, a colonel in the army, and his grandson Raúl Rodriguez Castro, nicknamed the Crab, head of his personal guard. So it was the Castron family showing all its powers in front of Obama, or maybe showing its fears. The first event open to the public, just after this meeting, confirmed all Castro's fear. It was a public disaster and showed Obama as a statesman with control of the scene, and Raúl Castro as an old grumpy dictator out of control, trying to ignore conflicting questions and reacting abruptly against a journalist who made a question about political prisoners in Cuba. Ordinary Cubans interviewed by independent journalists in the streets of Havana expressed embarrassment by the way the head of the state conducted himself in front of the press and praised Obama as the modern leader they would like to have in Cuba. The next day, President Obama delivered his speech to the Cuban people, broadcasted live on national Cuban TV controlled by the Cuban government. The regime showed once again its fears, choosing as the venue for the speech a closed environment. Obama's speech was delivered at the Grand Theater of Havana. It was totally remodeled for the event. That way, the regime wanted to have control of the environment, filling the theater with party apparatchiks. Prior to Obama's visit, I have a chance to, me and a group of dissidents living inside Cuba, we have a chance to meet with Ben Rhodes, the main advisor to President Obama, and he was the one assigned to the task of writing Obama's speech. So I have to say that many of our recommendations for the visit and also for the speech were taken into account. Obama used simple words, talked directly to the Cuban people, mentioned Cuba icons in exile like Celia Cruz, Gloria Estefan, and presented a vision of tomorrow for Cubans, and that was very important, to present a vision of tomorrow for the Cuban people that didn't include the Cuban government. There are a lot that can be said about this speech. I just was going to mention 4 of the phrases that Obama uses during this speech. He says in one part, "I'm here to normalize relations with the Cuban people, not with the Cuban government." He also said, "I believe the people has the right to criticize their government and also to peacefully protest against the government. I know a place which is a testament to what Cubans can do. It's called Miami." You have to realize that Miami is a bad word for the Cuban government. Miami represents what Cubans can do when they have freedom for their creativity, as Obama says. And finally, he says another thing which I believe is very important, that he says there are 2 Cuban Americans, Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, in the race for President of the United States. Majority of the Cuban people didn't know that, and this was a recognition of the talent and the political power of the Cuban community in the United States. The last 2 events of the visits, the meeting with Cuban dissidents and the attendance to the baseball game, cemented the historical characters of Obama's presence in Cuba. He said what nobody else dared to say before. I'm talking about head of states or head of government that had visited Cuba before Obama. And he broke the monopoly of the Castro regime in the representation of Cuba's nationality, reaching directly to the Cuban people. He went to a Cuban comedy TV show, something that no Cuban communist leader has ever done in 57 years in power. And he used Cuban slang expressions like "Que vola Cuba," that was Obama's message to Cuba. Que vola means like, what's up, Cuba? But Obama was trying to communicate, as we suggested, in the codes that the Cuban people used to communicate themselves. But there is a difference between the visit and the reestablishment of relations between the two countries. The new relations between the United States and Cuba are the result of a geopolitical process designed to push and promote Obama's legacy as President of the United States and his place in American history, more than his place in Cuban history, of course. This process is a well-conceived and staged political spectacle with both sides of the story, Cuban dictatorship and the United States government, trying to play their best. The visit was probably the final act of this show, considering that Obama is leaving office this year. His performance was great, no doubt about it. He reinforced the legacy. He destroyed 57 years of Cuban rhetoric with 48 hours of personal charisma. A clear and inspirational speech to the Cuban people and gestures oriented to the Cuban people and not the Cuban government. His show was way better than Raúl Castro's show. And he ended up being more popular in Cuba than Raúl Castro himself. The reaction from the Cuban government before and after the trip is the best testament of that. Gramma, the official Cuban newspaper, published several editorials before Obama's visit and after Obama's visit, saying that the revolution is still alive, that we still have to be careful about the United States, and probably the worst and the most deadly act after Obama's visit was an article, an editorial in the Havana Tribune newspaper. All newspapers in Cuba are controlled by the Cuban government, as it was here in Poland during communist times. This editorial in Havana Tribune was a very racist editorial with the title saying, "Negro, tú eres sueco? Negro, are you pretending to be Swedish?" Using a joke, a racist joke that some people in Cuba use to minimize black people in Cuba and spreading stereotypes about black people in Cuba. That was published in the newspaper Havana Tribune, that is a voice of the Cuban youth communists in Havana. Yes, Mr. Obama went to Cuba, but that's not the end of the story, because U.S.-Cuba relations was never the beginning of Cuba's problem. The Cuba problem started on January 1st, 1959, when a self-proclaimed messiah named Fidel Castro took power and then shortly installed a family communist dictatorship to rule the country. That's when the Cuban problem started, not when the relations with the United States. As President Obama himself expressed in his great speech to the Cuban people, he didn't go there to change Cuba. El futuro de Cuba está en las manos de los cubanos, said Obama in his speech. The future of Cuba is in the hands of Cuba. He said it in Spanish because he wanted the message to get clear and sound to the Cuban people. So considering this, now it's time to look more at the heart of the matter. the relationship between the Cuban government and the Cuban people, characterized by the activists who every day face repression, violence, harassment, prison, and exile to change that future beyond the dictatorship. Yes, Mr. Obama went to Cuba. And the same as in the iconic film from which this presentation took his name, the movie is called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and I thank again Pierre for that. A lot of business and obscure interest went to Cuba with him. But different from the film, Barack Obama is not the politically naive character played by Jimmy Stewart in the movie, and neither he needed to resort to filibuster to achieve his goals. He said what he needed to be said in Cuba and did what needed to be done. Wasn't all that everybody wanted, including me, or what everybody would have done in that position. But going back to the Rolling Stones, you can't always get what you want. The part played by the Cuban people, however, moves along the lines of other classical political themes that we mentioned before in this presentation. Welcome, Mr. Marshall, and a story in Spain in the 1940s after the end of the war, when a town in Spain was waiting for an American delegation to pass by to get some assistance from the Marshall Plan. The American motorcade in Havana, saying as in this movie, passed throughout a population desperately waiting for some Plan Marshall, a new Plan Marshall, to save them. Both the Americans and the natives, in this case the Cuban, entrenched in their own stereotypes about each other. Washington didn't change because Mr. Smith went there, and of course, Cuba is not going to change because Mr. Obama went there. The United States is still ruled by a democracy, and Cuba is still ruled by a dictatorship. So the essential elements of this equation are still in place. They haven't changed at all. So, stereotypes, hopes, and perceptions aside, the lesson here is simple. Freedom and democracy for Cuba is still the cause. And Cubans have to produce the result by themselves. Fight your own fight, and don't expect anybody to fight it for you. Yes, you can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you might find you get what you need. That's what the song says. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you might find you get what you need. People in Poland know that lesson. The real happy ending for this story in Havana is yet to come. Thank you.
So we have time for questions now. Okay, let me start then. In your talk, you've mentioned that Obama's term is about to finish. So, who do you think will be the next president, and how do you think will that affect the Cuban-American relations? And is there a possibility that the new president will reverse this new opening between America and Cuba?
Well, let me start by the end. It's very difficult for a president to break relations with the country, except for the case of a NATO war or something like that. So it's going to be very difficult for whoever becomes the next president of the United States. It's going to be very difficult for him or her to change the new framework of relations. Maybe they can change some measures, but relations between Cuba and the United States is a fact right now. Who's going to be the next president of the United States? I don't know. Probably
Who would be best for Cuba?
I think the best for Cuba is not in the race anymore. I think it would be Marco Rubio, who had been the best. He's Cuban, he's young, he's talented, he's very good in foreign policy, and he has a clear view of what needs to be done in the case of Cuba. So the options for the Cuban people really right now are minimal. Both of the strongest runners right now are, sadly to say, Hillary Clinton and no one else that Donald Trump. So the odds are very difficult, and I think the American people is more worried right now who's going to be the next president than the Cuban people. The Cuban people had their own problems to deal. Raúl Castro is going to be the next president, who is the current president, and now he's talking about his son. So for Cuba, I don't think it's going to be too important who's going to be the next president of the United States. Anybody else? Don't be shy, you can ask whatever you want.
Okay, I have one more then to maybe warm everybody up. Do you think that it is possible that when Raúl Castro, if say that he wants to transfer the power to his son, do you think that the Castro's son, Raúl Castro's son, would be actually it would be possible for him to retain power, or would that kind of change it? And because I think that it's very interesting to see what would happen if the son takes power. The Castro brothers are there, they're the heroes of the revolution, but the son is not, right? So will he be able to kind of stay in power like the Castro family is doing now, or will that be the beginning of the end of the regime?
I don't think so. I think he will be able to retain power because there is a system in place, and that's the most important thing. A lot of people believe that Raúl Castro was not going to be able to retain power once Fidel stepped out, but it happened. And another thing is that the ideological character of the regime is being changed. So now the question is about money. Who has money in Cuba? The Castro family has the money in Cuba. They behave like a mafia family. They give their power from one to the other. They control the main pools of money in Cuba. The son of Fidel Castro is the head of the Cuban Federation of Baseball, which is one of the main sources of money in Cuba, because baseball players go to the United States and they sign contracts for hundreds of millions of dollars, or tens of millions of dollars. So now what they are trying to do is to tell those baseball players, you can't come back to Cuba because they are declared defectors and they cannot go back to Cuba. So they are saying you can come back, but you have to give me part of your contract. And also the new contract that can be signed. They have even reached an agreement between the Major League Baseball and the Cuban authority, the Cuban Federation of Baseball, to sign players inside Cuba, giving a part to the federation. That's why there was a baseball game during the visit of Barack Obama to Cuba. That was not a coincidence. So they are controlling Cuba's economy. 85% of Cuba's economy is controlled by Grupo Gaesa. It's a mega corporation who's headed by Raúl Castro's son-in-law, Alberto López Calleja. So the head of the guard of Raúl Castro, the guy called the crab because he has 6 fingers, he has 1 finger that comes from here, is the son of Alberto López Calleja. So they control the army, they control the security forces, and they control the money. So the system is being changed into probably Latin American dictatorship, or probably following some parties in Russia, on some other countries, to establish the illusion that there's going to be a democracy. We have an election, and so bad, we always win. That happens, the PRI, it was called the Party of the institutionalized revolution in Mexico, stay in power 70 years with that model. They have elections, but they always win. So probably that's what they are looking for. That's why we always insist that the only ones who can break this scheme created by the regime is the Cuban people. They organize and they are able to get numbers and present a specific challenge to the government in order to displace the government from power or forcing a negotiation between the opposition and the regime. But they need to achieve power in numbers. They need to reach out to the Cuban people.
Okay, I have one more for me, but that's all I have. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the regional context of this? Because there was all the talk when there was a crisis in Venezuela that this will affect Cuban American relations and that this will be one of the forces that will push Cuba to open up to Americans.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about this context and what was the impact of the crisis in Venezuela and did that have a big effect?
Well, first the Cuban government is trying to plan ahead of events. The fall of the communist empire took the Cuban government by surprise. They didn't believe it, and they didn't anticipate that was going to happen. So suddenly the Cuban government lost their main sources of income, of assistance, the Soviet Union, with the fall of the Soviet Union, and there was a huge crisis in Cuba. It was called the Special Period in Times of Peace. They are very good in creating names. It was a crisis, but they created that name. So the crisis was really, really so bad that the government practically got afraid of people going to the streets to demonstrate because the situation was very bad. So they find Hugo Chavez. They didn't find Hugo Chavez, they created Hugo Chavez. When I was in jail in 1992, I was in jail in Cuba for political reasons, and a high officer of the state security police took me out to interrogate me. And when I was sitting there, he threw me a paper, a Venezuelan paper, when Hugo Chavez tried to conduct the coup. And he was in jail, and he told me, you see, Omar, we are everywhere. This guy, we created this guy, and we're going to take him out of jail, and he's going to be the next president of Venezuela. So they created Chavez to rescue them from the huge crisis they had in 1990s. So now, when Venezuela, they see that it's going to be very difficult for Maduro to sustain the Venezuela as it is, or also the so-called socialism of the 21st century is falling into pieces, losing elections in Argentina, even losing elections in Venezuela. The parliament is in the hands of the opposition now. So they are planning ahead. So that's why they reach out to the United States. They create this impression that they were open and they wanted to talk, because now for the Cuban regime, their main concern is survival. It's not political or ideological rhetoric. They're not interested even in being called a so-called revolution anymore. They want money, they want to survive, and they want to place, the Castro family want to place all their members in positions where they can get money. So that's why they reach out to the United States. It was the perfect storm. Obama was in power, Fidel Castro was not able to be in power anymore, because there is a lot of mythology about Fidel Castro, the guy that from his bed, he raised a finger and everybody's trembling. That's not happening. So Raul Castro is in control. They use Fidel Castro once in a while, as a friend of mine said, that they use him as a scarecrow in order to induce fear in the people. After Obama's visit, Fidel Castro published a so-called reflection. He writes editorials or whatever you want to call it. And they are called reflections. And he wrote a reflection on attacking Obama. Another important thing during the visit is that Obama refused to meet with Fidel Castro. Even in spite of the Cuban government pushing for it. And he said, no, he's not. He doesn't hold any official position in Cuba anymore, so I'm not going to meet him. Different from any other dignitaries that have gone to Cuba, even the President of France, a lot of presidents and prime ministers have gone to Cuba and they have seen Fidel Castro and taken pictures with him. After Obama's visit, after Fidel Castro wrote that editorial, he appeared on TV. It was a pathetic view, I have to say. He looked like a man living in a mental asylum, but they needed to show him. They needed to show the scared crowd to induce fear in the Cuban population, sending the message the revolution is still alive. Make no mistake. Yes, we're talking with the Americans, but we are still revolutionaries, the so-called revolutionaries. So I think at the end of the day, what they are looking for now is looking for money. They are looking to place themselves in good positions because they envision the future of Cuba, but there is not going to be this communist regime as it is right now. They are the first one to realize that. But they are even working ahead than the opposition, which is the real danger in Cuba right now.
Well, I would like to ask about your views on the possibilities of Cuban future. I mean, basically two possibilities. One, that of the regime, the political system collapsing as it did collapse in Soviet Union, Poland, Romania, Hungary, and so on, or Cuba remaining a totalitarian communist dictatorship, which is possible, as it's illustrated by the cases of North Korea, Vietnam, or People's China. Which possibility is more probable from your point of view?
Well, I can tell you one for sure. Cuba is not going to remain a totalitarian regime because the regime doesn't want to be totalitarian anymore. That's what I was explaining. They want to change in their own way. Raúl Castro's slogan is, they said, without hurry, but without stopping. Meaning we are moving, but we are moving at our own pace. So they don't want to be totalitarian anymore. They know that it's not profitable in this global world. And they look at North Korea and they see what's going on. So they don't want to do it. But the other possibility that you mentioned is that people can face the regime and dismantle the regime, or even the opposition and the people got so much power that forced the regime to negotiate, like it happened in Poland with the Round Table and Solidarność. So that's the possibility that we are working for. What we do at the Cuban American National Foundation is to help dissident leaders inside Cuba. We provide material support, we send informational support. We took some of them out of Cuba to go to places. Actually, I have been here in Poland several times with dissidents from Cuba, so they can learn about successful experience of people facing totalitarian regimes, like Poland, like the Czech Republic, like Serbia, for example. So they need to learn the lessons. So we are working towards that possibility that you mentioned, which is the best possibility for the Cuban people. That's what we are doing.
I would like to ask, because most of us we are raised on Western culture, and we're aware of American Dream, and I would like to ask you how it looks for Cuban people. Like, is the American Dream term popular? Like, they would like to, young people move and live and start their life in Americas. And besides how it's possible, of course, but it's not that simple for us either. But I'm just curious, is it like popular?
Well, you know that the most popular nationality inside Cuba are Americans. There is a popular word, slang word, as you say, to call Americans. Nobody knows where that word came from. It's called Yuma. Yuma is a town in Ohio in the United States, but nobody knows how people in Cuba ended up calling the Americans the Yumas, los Yumas. And it's so popular that any foreigner in Cuba, the majority of the people call them Yumas, even if they are Polish or French or from Tanzania. If he's foreigner, he's Yuma. And if he's foreigner, he's good. Everything that comes from outside Cuba is good, because Cuba is so bad. And that's the reasoning inside Cuba. For example, people in Cuba used to say when something was really good, they said it comes from outside. And you show a jacket and you say, no, this jacket is from outside. And everybody was like, wow. I'm going to tell you an anecdote about this. In the 1980s, me and my brother were trying to survive in the black market in Cuba. I graduated from the University of Havana. I was sanctioned for criticizing the government. I graduated as an economist at the University of Havana. So they didn't allow me to work because all jobs belong to the government. And I had to survive in the black market. So me and my brother were selling shirts. We have a cousin who made the shirts. We had the clothing and he made the shirts and we sold the shirts. When we went to somebody and showed the shirt, and the shirt has a label, a Cuban label, and we said, okay, we're selling these shirts in 25 Cuban pesos. The person looked at the shirt, oh, it's nice, it looks good. I said, oh, but it's Cuban. No, I don't want it. And nobody wanted to buy the shirt. So what we did, me and my brother, we took away the Cuban labels and we sewed American labels from all clothes. And then we sold all the shirts in 50 Cuban pesos. So that's the mentality of Cuba. Yes, the American dream is alive, well alive in Cuba. Not even 57 years of propaganda on national TV, on all radio stations, newspapers saying that Americans are bad, there's a Yankee imperialism, all Cubans want to go to the United States. That's a problem. And to be frank about that, that's a huge problem in Cuban society. Why? Because there are a lot of young women raising their children alone because the young males are the ones who want to risk themselves at sea. They throw themselves at sea in anything that floats in order to get to the United States. So there are a family separation until they can bring their family to the United States. But people in Cuba are obsessed to get to the United States and especially to Miami. I don't know if you know that there was a huge crisis, migration crisis in Central America, 8,000 Cubans in Costa Rica. There was a flow. There was a human trafficking operation that started in Ecuador. Cubans get a visa to go to Ecuador. And then from Ecuador, they start crossing borders to get to Mexico and to the United States. But then Nicaragua closed their borders, and then the Cubans could not go through. So they start accumulating in Costa Rica, to the point that there were 8,000 Cubans in Costa Rica. So there was a meeting between all the Central American countries to solve that crisis. So they flew the Cubans over Nicaragua, and then they deposited them in El Salvador, and they keep on going to the United States. All the humanitarian agencies in Florida, they always suggest Cubans to go to other places. If you go to Ohio or other places in the United States, they receive more assistance. Like an apartment for 3 months until they find in New York, they all want to go to Miami because it's the Mecca for them. So yes, everything that is American is well, I said, admired and respected inside Cuba beyond reality in many cases. A lot of people who went to the Rolling Stones concert in Havana, they didn't know that the Rolling Stones were from England. They thought they were Americans, they were Yumas. So they were saying, no, this is a good Yuma group. Believe me, the majority of the people didn't even know that they were from England. Yes, and that's a result of the regime propaganda. The regime created so much propaganda against the United States that people in Cuba who don't believe the regime, they don't believe the regime, so what they did is they started believing that, okay, if the Cuban government is talking bad about them, then they are good. So that was the reason.
I am very curious about the changing mentality of young people in Cuba, because our generation should be the most educated and global thinking one. I'm curious if that happens in Cuba too, if they are changing or maybe organizing something and thinking of a better future, or is it just like stuck in place?
Well, it's very difficult to think global when you are inside a so close environment like Cuba. So your question is very interesting. Cubans are being, especially young people in Cuba, are being left out of the global thinking because they live in a country with only 3% of internet penetration. Not only 3% of internet penetration, Cubans are not allowed to connect to internet from their houses. They cannot plug in a computer here and start connecting to the internet. That's not allowed. Recently, and it's important, it's very important that you have asked that kind of question, because there has been a lot of talks in Cuba about the Wi-Fi points. Wi-Fi points are like internet cafes created in a park in Havana, where people go and they have to pay for it, of course, and they have to pay 2 Cuban convertible pesos, which is practically 1/3 of their monthly salary for 1 hour of internet. So as you can imagine, nobody's able to pay 1/3 of his salary to connect to the internet. The connection is very slow. If you try to download a video, you lose the hour and probably you don't see anything. But still, a lot of people talk about the wonderful Wi-Fi points. That means that the Cuban government is opening and Cuba is changing. And I always say, the first time I came to Poland, many years ago, not that many ago, 2 years ago, I connected in internet cafes in Poland. And I always mention that. I went to an internet cafe because even in some hotels they didn't have access to internet. And I went there and I paid and I connected to the internet, a high-speed connection. But that's not the future, that's the past. Because I said, when I go to Poland now, there are no internet cafes. Why? Because everybody can connect themselves. And in the United States, in every country in the world, when you go to a Wi-Fi hotspot, it's because it's free. You go to McDonald's and then, yeah, you have your hamburger and you can connect free. You have to pay. So Wi-Fi hotspots should be free. In Cuba, they are paid, and they are calling that the future of internet. So Cubans are out of that equation. exploitation. And so they don't think globally. A lot of young people are organizing to protest against the government. And I think it's the best way to do it. You need to get rid of the government in order to be able to open to the outside world. And believe it or not, a lot of people in Cuba don't know who Lech Walesa is. We have kind of a funny anecdote with young people that we bring here to Poland to have a learning exchange about what happened here. And then he was listening about, we're going to have a meeting with Lech Walesa. And he was listening in Cuba. We said Walesa instead of Walesa, 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 we're going to meet with Walesa. And suddenly the guy said, who's that girl? He had never heard the name of Lech Walesa. So that's a signal of how people are, secluded in such a close society. And yes, that's one of the main issues for Cubans, especially for young Cubans, because you cannot function effectively in the modern world if you don't think globally, if you don't know the tools that everybody uses. And that's been a huge problem in Cuban society right now, something that we have to solve in the future. Yes. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for the question. When I think about the history of the relations between the United States and Cuba before the Castro's revolution, it's kind of safe to say that it's mostly exploitation of Cuba by the United States in business. And I wonder, let's say that it would be possible to for a democratic rule on Cuba, in Cuba. And do you think that there would be any animosity or a kind of, how to put it, would the United States be considered a good partner in establishing democracy, or there would be any animosity from this historical context?
Well, from the part of the Cuban people, there is no animosity. As I explained, for the Cuban people, Americans are the humans. They are the best. Even out of proportion, as it might seem to everybody. But let me tell you something. That idea, I would say that stereotype, that the relations between Cuba and the United States before the revolution were the history of exploitation by American interests of the Cuban people is not exactly right. Mm-hmm. Of course, there have been incidents. Cuba was occupied by the United States 2 times during the Republican period, the period of the Republic, to speak properly. And there was something called the Platt Amendment. That was really horrible. The Platt Amendment gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuba anytime they consider it properly. But, for example, in terms of business, as you say, before the revolution took power, 53%, and you can consult that those figures in the United States, the United Nations, the United States, annually, 53% of Cuban businesses already belong to Cuban owners. The Americans didn't control the Cuban economy. And I compare that to now, when we have 85% of Cuban economy controlled by one person, who is the son-in-law of the dictator in power. So it's not like that. It wasn't the exploitation. I can give you an example. I'm a black guy created in a family people in Cuba, races are very mixed. You can see in a family, you can see a black guy, you can see a white guy. But I'm giving you this example because blacks, Afro-descendants, black or mulattoes like me, are the most deprived sector in Cuban society. But this situation had gotten worse during the revolution than before the revolution. Cuba has a president of the Senate who was a black guy before the revolution. Cuba has governors, congressmen, and when the communists took power, that possibility disappeared. The elite of the Cuban Communist Party are white people, mostly male. The regime is a machoist regime, racist regime, a family regime. If you look at, you can go to the internet and look at the political bureau of the Cuban Communist Party, and you will see probably two people. In a country where more than 65% of the population is black or mulattoes. Even the Cuban regime falsified the statistics, saying that black and mulattoes are the minority in Cuban society. If you look at Cuban official statistics, you have to laugh. Everybody that had gone to Cuba couldn't believe that. They said that 33%, something like that, of the Cuban population is black or mulattoes. If you walk any street of Havana, you see that's a lie. So the economic disadvantages of the Cuban population were not related to the dominance of the United States government exploiting the Cuban people. That was probably something to be changed. Actually, the revolution was created and conducted in order to amend some of these disadvantages inside the democratic system. And then Fidel Castro proclaimed that Cuba was a socialist country because it was the only way for him to stay in power forever. And that changed the course of the revolution, and a lot of people believe that the revolution was betrayed. Actually, more than 300 members of the Revolution Army are in the United States. Some of them have died. My own uncle, Omar Montenegro, he was the head of the labor union in Cuba, and he started fighting with Fidel Castro. Then he continued fighting against Fidel Castro, and he ended up in exile in Miami. That's a typical procedure. But it wasn't like that. It wasn't like American exploiting the Cubans.
I've heard that in many Latin American countries, it's like when Europeans come there to work and to live, they get better opportunities, they get better jobs, they live in better conditions. And I was just curious if it's the same case with Cuba, or
It's the same case. No Europeans, any foreigner in Cuba get benefits. First, because he received payment in foreign currency, and Cubans don't have access to foreign currency unless they work in the tourist sector or they get some tips. But yes, in Cuba, not only Europeans, any foreigners. In Cuba, there are stores who sell only to foreigners, and Cubans are not allowed to buy in these stores. There are in Cuba, even there are hospitals. For example, people talk so much about the Cuban health system being one of the best in the world. I would say it's free. That's what you can say about the Cuban health system. It's not good for Cubans. You go to a pharmacy for Cubans, and sometimes they don't even have aspirins. My mother died in Cuba. I never saw my mother again when I left Cuba because I'm not allowed to enter Cuba. And I never saw my father again. My mother died in Cuba. When she was in the hospital, I had to send practically everything from Miami. Blankets, soap, towels, money to buy food in the black market, because there was nothing. in the hospital. And that's a typical condition in Cuban hospital. But they have hospital for foreigners. And they charge the funny thing is that for Cubans, healthcare is free, but it's lousy. For foreigners, healthcare is good, but it's not free, they have to pay for it. And that's how you see capitalism working inside a communist society. If you pay, yeah, you get the best treatment. Or you don't pay, you know, you have to wait 5 years for a surgery, or we have no aspirin, come tomorrow, things like that. So that's the difference.
May I ask when was the last time you've been in Cuba?
The last time I've been in Cuba, the day I left. May 28, 1992. 24 years. And I'm not ashamed to tell you that I was one of the worst days in my life. It was the day that I have felt the biggest fear that I have felt in my life. Not even when I was in jail, not even when I was persecuted or being beaten by members of the Cuban police, because I was afraid that what really happened, that I never saw my family again. I saw my brothers 16 years after I left Cuba, and I saw my mother, I saw my sister 15 years. He came 1 year before to the United States. Never saw my father, never saw my mother, never saw my grandfather. And I think that when people talk about Cuba, and I'm sorry if I get emotional about this, but this is something very deep inside of me. When people start talking about political equations, U.S.-Cuba relations, I always say, who's going to return me that? Which political combination or solution to the Cuban problem? And it's not only mine. It's not only mine. It's thousands of people that have died outside Cuba. And they have never been able to return. I read this book. This is probably the best compilation of Cuban history on the communism. And it was written by Professor Juan Clark. I knew Professor Clark is probably one of the most, I would say, comprehensive academic or investigator that I have ever seen. He searched everything. That's why he had to do volumes for this book. Professor Clark committed suicide in Miami. He was sick, and he was depressed, and he would never see Cuba again. And he took his life. That's a good example. So, whatever people can say about Cuba, Castro, whatever, it comes, at the end of the day, it comes up to this. Nobody has the right to decide who's Cuban and who's not, or how people relate to their families. That's evil, and that's why the Cuban government is evil. I don't care what anybody can say about the Cuban government. A government who's able to do that is an evil government, and it doesn't have a right to exist.
Okay, so on that powerful note, I think that we can thank you very much for your time and for